Welcome to Creation in the 21st Century. I'm your host, Carl Baugh, founder and director of the Creation Evidence Museum in Glen Rose, Texas. The title to today's program is, What Weaknesses? Here's a few. Now, there's a reason for that catchy title. Assuming that they will not be critiqued by the public in general and by the academic community at large, proponents for evolutionary theory currently say why the theory of evolution is so well thought out, so well demonstrated in the fossil record in the laboratory, that there are no weaknesses in it. Therefore, it should not be critiqued. Well, especially in the laboratory and biology, microbiology, in the field experiments, and I literally dig dinosaurs. I've had the privilege so far of discovering and directing the excavation of 16 different dinosaurs. And you understand that one leads to another, and many very fine associates have been a part of discovering some of those, all under the direction of this museum director. So it's a very exciting field of research. Now, the theory of evolution has many weaknesses, and we want to clarify again. Microevolution, variation on a horizontal plane, occurs. But the theory of evolution, as publicly announced and espoused, assumes living organisms arrived in a simple state from inorganic, non-living material, meaning your great-great-great-great-grandfather was a rock. And from those early organic compounds developed living systems up to the expression today that we see, and that's demonstrated in the fossil record. Finally, man arrived to examine that fossil record. Well, I've invited to the studio today a very special friend and colleague who was involved in some of those discussions recently, Professor John Heffner. 39 years, public education individual, 14 of those at the college level, almost 14 years. Just under 14 years. You're always so accurate, and I appreciate that. You're scientific in your entire outlook of everything. You were present. In fact, you were one of the principals involved in the Texas Education Committee, and you gave some recommendations, and Eugenie Scott was present on that occasion, I believe. Would you tell us who she is and what she said?
Well, I believe I'm accurate in saying she's the president or CEO or chairman of the National Center for Scientific Education, something like that, which is essentially a watchdog group, make sure those pesky creationists stay out of schools.
Now, it would be commendable if science education were observed and practiced, but unfortunately, the history of that movement is to make sure that evolution is held in an imperial position. Is that correct?
Well, by and large, we think so. There's many instances where it is a sheltered theory, the only theory of science that needs laws to protect it from competition.
Isn't that tragic?
And she and I were both speakers at a conference, a hearing in Austin in early January of '09, addressing the State Board of Education concerning the TEKS in Texas, T-E-K-S, Texas Essential Knowledge and Skills, was under review. And as it pertained to the science courses, then, you know, we addressed some issues that were there.
Yes. And so the discussion came up on either leaving the concept in textbooks, the concept of addressing weaknesses of evolutionary theory. What was her position, and is the position of adherence to evolutionary dogma?
Well, she was quoted in the Dallas Morning News as saying there are no weaknesses in evolution.
What weaknesses?
What weaknesses?
Here's a few.
So I thought I might just point out a few that
As
that
an
I knew
educator,
about.
will you do that for us, please?
Her quote was on January 22nd of '09. And so I thought I would just point out a few that were somewhat obvious. One, I think, is that we need to talk about Charles Darwin. He is their icon. They hold him in such high regard, and oftentimes once a person's gone, then they're eulogized even more so. And he's credited with the modern promotion of the theory of evolution. I'm sure it was before him. But I want the audience to see that the actual title of his book shows that he probably was a racist. The Origin of Species is all most anybody knows. But by means of natural selection is another part of the title, or the preservation of favored races in the struggle for life.
Favored races?
Favored races.
Here we are propounding the theory, not just proposing, but stating the concept that we're all created equal, and that's part of our heritage in the United States and our biblical heritage. And races each have superior areas of genetic information and expression. So for him in this day to be known to be a racist, I think is disfavorable to him.
It is, and racism's a terrible thing, but you know, oddly enough, the Bible doesn't speak of races of men. It speaks of nations of men. And Acts 17:26, God is made of one blood, every nation of man.
You're right.
And we need to have our thinking structured properly. And few people know that at the very root of evolution is a racist book, essentially the Bible of the story.
I would call that a weakness.
Here's another one. Horizontal doesn't equal vertical. The average person doesn't quite know what I'm talking about, but when you ask, well, what is the evidence for evolution? You'll hear something like, well, horses are faster now than they used to be, or NBA basketball players are taller than they used to be, or birds migrate farther than they used to, or something like that. See, there's evolution is true. However, what they've been shown is evidence of horizontal variation within a created kind.
Yes, information's already there.
Still horses, still men, still birds.
Yes.
And that's been turned as if it was evidence for one kind of creature turning into another, as the theory of evolution would
to graduate to a higher order, which has never been observed, even and cannot be accomplished even in the laboratory.
That's right. And only horizontal changes have been observed within boundaries.
Yes.
Horses not turning into anything else, and so forth. And in fact, this New Scientist article back in '03 says nobody knows how a mixture of lifeless chemicals in some imagined little pond on the side of a volcano or something spontaneously organize themselves into the first living cell.
And this is a major scholar publishing in a totally secular publication.
Well, this is, yes it is, and it's a huge hurdle for the theory of evolution to suppose that just some chemical mix could produce a living membrane-encased cell with all of the complexity, as we'll touch on in a few minutes, but the sliding clamps and the protein chaperones and the sensors at the cell wall and all those kinds of things. And evolutionists have great faith. Let it be pointed out that they are people of great faith.
To envision by faith how that could occur.
That's right.
And yet after not only hundreds of millions, but billions of dollars in apparatus in the laboratory, have not been able to demonstrate that. In fact, I wrote a book some time ago, Why Do Men Believe Evolution Against All Odds? And I quoted some of their leading scholars who admitted that not only do we not know how life originated from non-living compounds to the first living cell or precursor of the cell, we cannot even imagine how it could have happened.
Yes.
So that's an incredible leap of faith.
It is, and it needs to be pointed out that there's a great deal of faith that is involved in that. And let not someone get away with saying, well, I'm an evolutionist because I believe in the evidence. Men believe in evolution despite the evidence, not because of it.
Despite the evidence. That's a major weakness.
Unknown chemicals coming together involving an unknown process at an unknown time, an unknown place, and yet they just believe it happened. And then they say, well, we got the first cell, and eventually we got pond scum, as one quote I read says we could trace our ancestry ostensibly back to pond scum. But see, evolution is all about information gain.
Yes.
To go from pond scum to, say, Einstein, you've got to have increased DNA information. And DNA is coded instructions. It's not just information, it's instructions on how to build something.
Yes.
Whether it's a physical structural part like a finger, or whether it's molecular or chemical, it is instructions, and it requires huge increases in DNA. Evolutionists believe this information arose from birth defects, beneficial mutations, they would say. They think that is the only, and that is their only game in town, because they won't allow for our Creator and His intelligence to have anything to do with it. Well, the truth of the matter is mutations do not cause an increase in information. They only cause a loss of information.
So hundreds of millions of birth defects produced Einstein.
Well, they would say, because the pond scum has no DNA for lungs, say, or eyes, or something like that. Well, how did you get the information? Well, mistakes, 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 and gradually it would build that code. And so my challenge is, well, tell us something else that was created that has less complexity than a human being, you know, just by mistakes.
Okay, and see if it flies.
Well, in this mutation summary, it says the random rewriting of the DNA code, some of these scenarios were beneficial and therefore naturally selected and conferred an advantage to that organism. And here's the deal, though. Beneficial is a highly subjective term. Yes. Sometimes when asked for an example, they'll say, well, stunted wings on beetles.
But are they beneficial? The beetle can't fly.
Yeah, or not as well, but they say, well, he lives on a windy island, so it is an advantage to him because he's not blown out to sea where he's eaten. But hardly anyone would say stunted wings and mutated things like that is beneficial. So it's highly subjective as to what you're going to categorize as beneficial. Most mutations are neutral or lethal.
Certainly.
Sometimes just the slightest thing makes it lethal. A mutation's a birth defect. It always results in a loss of information.
Always.
So how are you going to have a net gain in information to go from pond scum to Einstein with losing information all along the way? It's a complete logical fallacy to think it happens, and it's time that that be pointed out as a weakness.
As a major weakness.
And it's illogical to go downhill for 1,000,000 steps and then up for 1 step and conclude that life somehow has an upward urge.
Well, this is equivalent
complexity.
In the field of finance to saying, well, I'm only going to lose a few dollars on this product, but I'll make it up in volume. Well, you lose major, big time in the volume in the long run.
Exactly. One of our great scholars on genes, John Sanford, the inventor of the gene gun.
Yeah, now let's spend a moment on that. This is a major scholar, published scholar, Cornell University, inventor of the gene gun, so he's very knowledgeable in this area. We're not just pulling out of the hat some individual who might favor what we'd like for him to say as we talk about mistakes and weaknesses in evolutionary theory. So what does this major scholar, Dr. John Sanford, have to say?
Well, in his book, The Mystery of the Genome, he points out that mutations are lethal, harmful, or neutral. And the term beneficial mutations is really just wishful thinking.
Yes.
Even single-cell life is extremely complex. And a very key point of this program today is we've never observed order and complexity arising from disorder by chance.
Never.
It always requires coded information or instructions on how to become complex.
Specific coded information targeted for a specific body that will incorporate and apply it.
That's right. And what we're actually finding, even when we look at single-celled organisms, is that they are an incredible world of designed nanotechnology, very small technology with complex circuits, sliding clamps, membrane pumps, protein chaperones, molecular machines, etc.
This is overwhelming.
In fact, just the energy that's required for a cell and consequently a whole organism to live requires the ATP molecule, adenosine triphosphate. And as it releases energy, it converts to ADP, adenosine diphosphate. But it is recycled back to the mitochondria where it picks up that other molecule. This is another long-chain molecule, like DNA is a long-chain molecule, with what they call a water wheel in the mitochondria, maybe spinning as much as 200 revolutions per minute. And in the course of a day's time, the process of accumulating that ATP, which is then used in energy production, the average human produces about 400 pounds of ATP a day. And if that was ever interrupted, the organism would die.
Certainly. And it all had to be in place to begin with.
Yes, and I just recently read that on Creation Moments email. Just some incredible things being revealed there about the complexity of the cell. Now, to suppose that could happen by itself, then I would challenge them to show us something simpler. Show us the little red wagon that just assembled itself by itself.
Certainly.
Or a space shuttle, or something like that.
Give them space to prove the point.
That's right.
But again, major weaknesses again and again. And the audience needs to know another of the weaknesses in evolutionary theory is that not only the complexity of these individual components of the cell, like the DNA and the nucleus of the cell, have to be in place simultaneously. The proteins have to be in place. The protein synthesis factory has to be in place. This area right here has to be in place because this gives zip codes to the cell. That's the endoplasmic reticulum. And that gives zip codes to each of the proteins, telling them where to go to manufacture other proteins. All of this has to be in place simultaneously, or the cell will not function. In a matter of minutes, it begins to die. So time is not on the side of the evolutionist.
No.
Time is the enemy of evolutionary theory, and that's a weakness to the theory. All of this has to be in place. Giving some numbers, and you're a mathematician, there are 60,000 proteins in approximately 100 different specific configurations in each of these cells. The mathematical odds that those could self-organize, and again, they all have to be in place simultaneously, or it won't function and it begins to die. So it doesn't get another chance. It's gone. The mathematical odds are as follows in the technical literature. 1 chance in 10 to the 4,478,296 power. Now, you're a specialist in that. Anything beyond 1 chance in 10 to the 50th has 0 chance of occurring, meaning one of the weaknesses of evolutionary theory is the mathematics involved. There is no way that could be logically and scientifically supported as having developed by chance. All of those, and that's those just the proteins. You add the DNA, the mitochondrial DNA, the RNA, all of that just overwhelms evolutionary theory. I'd call that a weakness, wouldn't you?
I would too, and you know, it begs the question, why hold in derision those who have faith in a supreme intelligence that put it together when they in turn must hold faith that something to 10 to the millionth power, the average person, that doesn't mean anything to them, but there's like been said, I read in print, 10 to the 130th power of electrons in the entire universe that could be packed into it. That is a huge, huge number. Huge number,
Meaning a small, small chance, no chance at all.
Right.
And that needs to be exposed to the students.
Right.
Okay, weaknesses, what weaknesses?
Pressing on, if evolution is true, then why do we find the abrupt appearance of complex life in the fossil record? We should find confirmation of the story that it started out simple, 1 cell, and gradually became more complex. And yet when you look at the Cambrian, which is the lowest level of horizontally bedded strata that has fossil life in it, we find great complexity. It's a sudden burst. It looks like an instantaneous creation of life.
Yes.
Another stasis. I mean, another weakness. Stasis is another weakness. The law of nature is stasis, from which we get the word stationary, and it remains the same. How do you know you found, say, a fossil lemur? It looks like a lemur. Animals don't change into something else, a totally different kind. Variations within boundaries, okay, but not in a totally different kind.
Yes.
We are able to identify it with Linnaean classification because it looks like that and it is consistent. Another weakness is the second law of thermodynamics, because it says that over time things don't get better, they get worse. And new barn or old barn.
We know that.
We have a mirror, don't we? And we can tell that the law of nature is that things deteriorate over time. There is no upward urge in nature.
But that's a major, major factor in evolutionary theory, that somehow there's this invisible urge to grow more complex.
Which is in violation of a very well-established law of science.
Yes.
Another absence is the near absence of transitional fossils. For example, if reptiles evolved into birds, as evolution teaches, then the fossil record should be mostly those in-between kinds, not the terminal kinds that you started with and ended with, but mostly the in-between kinds. That's why they're always
reptiles and birds.
That's right. We're always looking for the missing link. It's actually a missing chain.
Yes.
Not a single link.
Yes.
And if they'll be honest with the public, they would have to say that's right. We find fossils of reptiles fully formed and functional, fossils of birds fully formed and functional. No creatures with half legs, half wings, half eyes, half anything.
And Dr. Chatterjee of Texas Tech University found in a so-called ancient layer fully formed birds when dinosaurs were barely evolving according to evolutionary theory. But that's just ignored. That's a weakness that is just ignored. Their own scholars have disproved the theory, but it's ignored in favor of a faith-based concept.
I remember Smithsonian Magazine having an article in the early 90s showing trackways of birds, dinosaurs, and bear tracks, all there at the same time. Well, that blows evolution out of the water, but that's the facts that are recorded in the fossil record. Those are facts. And it happens to agree with creation during a week's time. Here's another one, a spontaneous generation. Somehow that non-living chemicals in a soup of some kind could just spring to life. You know, we've never really created life in the lab, but if we ever do, it'll just confirm it takes intelligence and a directing code to do it.
Certainly.
And it's not a random
and a lot
event.
of expenditure of energy.
And money.
Yes.
Our friend Dr. Frank Sherwin said in the Acts and Facts, March of '09, says the fossil record tells one scenario while biological molecules tell a different story. That's a weakness that school children have a right to hear. Indeed, New Scientist magazine recently admitted that the neat classical Darwinian tree of systemics, talking about this, something akin to that, lies in tatters, torn to pieces by an onslaught of negative evidence.
Now, wait a minute. That's New Science magazine, a major secular publication, certainly not slanted toward intelligent design or creation. Would you read that again for this audience?
Well, this whole idea lies in tatters, torn to pieces by an onslaught of negative evidence.
Of actual evidence.
Not negative comments or negative opinions, but negative evidence. So evolution is not well supported by the evidence.
And would you give us an indication as to what this is saying?
Michael Behe at Lehigh University, formerly, coined the term irreducible complexity. So many things that we see in life, like the eye or the ear, the blood clotting system, or virtually anything.
That you can't function without. In fact, your demise
it has irreducible complexity. It didn't come from something simple, was sort of a good eye, and gradually over millions of years became a good eye. It evidently was a functioning eye all at one time. You see, you've got to have it all to have it at all.
Yes.
All of the components, whether it's biochemistry
all to have it at all.
Whether it's vision with the retina and the cornea and the lens and the optic nerve and rods and cones, and all of that has to work together right from the start, or you don't have a functioning eye.
Yes.
Soft tissue being found in dinosaur bones. That's certainly a weakness of evolution theory that says these things are millions, maybe hundreds of millions of years old. How in the world can you preserve that? How long will say shrimp last in your refrigerator even? Not very long. And yet here we find it. This is the facts of the real world.
In fact, the technical literature up until recently, up until this major discovery, assaulted the public with statement after statement that certainly within 10,000 years, all DNA and structure of flesh and blood vessels would have deteriorated within 10,000 years. They set the parameters, the boundaries were imposed by them. Now, in this so-called 64-million-year-old T-Rex skeleton, we find not only fibrous material, but blood vessels and flesh that's still elastic. Now, the audience needs to know that we do not agree with those long ages. We believe all of this is within recent time, and that dinosaur got caught in the worldwide flood.
Well, we need to point out again, when it comes to the past, no one has the past. We have ideas about it, and but these real long age things are very hard to justify scientifically.
They certainly are. In the moments that remain, there are many, many weaknesses in evolutionary theory. You have listed some. Would you just run through those for us?
The absence of vestigial organs that ostensibly are leftover vestiges of our evolutionary past, every one of them have been shown to have a modern purpose in them. The pineal gland and the coccyx bone and the appendix and different parts even of the human, the tonsils. The Big Bang Theory and the retrograde motion of planets has many problems and weaknesses.
It certainly has in astrophysics and astronomy.
If something exploded, all the chunks should spin in the same direction as the original and orbit the same way, and yet that doesn't happen. And the list goes on and on. How flight evolved on at least 4 different pathways. Birds, insects, mammals, and reptiles. How photosynthesis could have evolved. Complex chemistry involved there with sugars and all that. How cold-blooded animals could turn into warm-blooded animals.
That endothermic and ectothermic, totally different heart configuration.
Exactly.
2 valves, 4 chambers.
A 3-chambered cold-blooded animal's heart is going to evolve to a 4-chambered heart. How do they live during the transition? Those are weaknesses that are just glossed over and not pointed out. All these kinds of things. Explain how bottom-dwelling marine life ended up in high elevations, even on mountaintops. It sounds like a global flood. How egg-laying animals develop the ability to give live births, and the list just goes on and on. There's hardly any end to it, you know. how mammals and reptiles crawl back to the sea and turned into whales, dolphins, seals,
retracing their steps, plesiosaurs, etc.
I like this one. Which came first, the immune system or the need for it?
Oh.
Think about that. If you didn't have it, you would die. You have no immunity. Well, why would you have it if there was no need for it?
Certainly.
You know, it's a design system that's in place should you need it.
Yes.
It's that spare tire should you need it.
Yes.
You know? Explain complex information sequencing like the DNA code without intelligence, or the ATP or the ADP and the Krebs cycle and all of those things. How can evolution explain the emergence of sexual reproduction, given that male and female physiology would have to mutate and develop simultaneously?
And at the same place, simultaneously.
And there's a whole myriad of problems that, and yet there's answers in Genesis. There's answers in the Bible for those kinds of things.
And bird-like dinosaurs, like Struthiomimus,
they were lizard-hipped, and while the bulky, low-slung, heavy dinosaurs like Ankylosaurus were bird-hipped. The exact different physiology than what you would hope to find if you're an evolutionist.
Certainly.
You would hope the delicate little fast-running dinosaurs had bird hips. Then you could sell the story better, that they evolved to birds. Yet that's the reverse of what actually happened. So, I mean, there's just a few of dozens and dozens of weaknesses.
Weaknesses in evolutionary theory. We have seen that these weaknesses are mirrored. We've seen that when you look at it objectively, scientifically, it's obvious we did not arrive by evolutionary progression. We arrived as the product of an intelligent creation. That creator is knocking at your heart's door right now. He died for you, went through the grave, and arose. Would you ask him in your heart, Lord Jesus, right now, step into my heart and live, and I will serve you with all my heart.
Creation in the 21st Century has been sponsored by Trinity Broadcasting Network. And only with your love gift of support can this program stay on the air. So write to Creation in the 21st Century, P.O. Box A, Santa Ana, California, 92711.
Developed living systems up to the expression today that we see, and that's demonstrated in the fossil record. Finally, man arrived to examine that fossil record. Well, I've invited to the studio today a very special friend and colleague who was involved in some of those discussions recently, Professor John Heffner. 39 years, public education individual, 14 of those at the college level, almost 14 years. Just under 14 years. You're always so accurate, and I appreciate that. You're scientific in your entire outlook of everything. You were present. In fact, you were one of the principals involved in the Texas education. And you understand that one leads to another, and many very fine associates have been a part of discovering some of those, all under the direction of this museum director. So it's a very exciting field of research. Now, the theory of evolution has many weaknesses, and we want to clarify again. Microevolution, variation on a horizontal plane, occurs. But the theory of evolution, as publicly announced and espoused, assumes living organisms arrived in a simple state from inorganic, non-living material, meaning your great-great-great-great-grandfather was a rock. And from those early organic compound committee, and you gave some recommendations, and Eugenie Scott was present on that occasion, I believe. Would you tell us who she is and what she said?
Well, I believe I'm accurate in saying she's the president or CEO or chairman of the National Center for Scientific Education, something like that, which is essentially a watchdog group, make sure those pesky creationists stay out of schools.
Now, it would be commendable if science education were observed and practiced, but unfortunately, the history of that movement is to make sure that evolution is held in an imperial position. Is that correct?
Well,
Welcome to Creation in the 21st Century. I'm your host, Carl Baughs, founder and director of the Creation Evidence Museum in Glen Rose, Texas. The title to today's program is, What Weaknesses? Here's a few. Now, there's a reason for that catchy title. Assuming that they will not be critiqued by the public in general and by the academic community at large, proponents for evolutionary theory currently say why the theory of evolution is so well thought out, so well demonstrated in the fossil record in the laboratory, that there are no weaknesses in it. Therefore, it should not be critiqued. Well, especially in the laboratory and biology, microbiology, in the field experiments, and I literally dig dinosaurs. I've had the privilege so far of discovering and directing the excavation of 16 different dinosaurs.